In 1943, the German Luftwaffe pilot considered himself the aristocrat of the air. He flew machines like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190. These were aircraft designed with a specific philosophy: lightness, agility, lethality. The German design doctrine was born from the idea of the dogfight. They believed that the winner of an aerial duel was the pilot who could turn the tightest, climb the fastest, and outmaneuver his opponent. The Bf 109 was a marvel of this philosophy. It was tiny. The cockpit was so cramped that the pilot's shoulders practically touched the sides. It was essentially a large engine with a gun attached to it. German aces, the Experten, racked up hundreds of kills on the Eastern Front against the Soviets and in the West against the British Spitfires. They viewed themselves as knights. They viewed combat as a test of individual skill. When the Americans entered the air war over Europe, the German pilots were initially unimpressed. They saw the American pilots as drivers, not aviators. They believed the Americans relied on numbers and formations because they lacked the individual brilliance of the German hunter. German intelligence briefed the pilots on the enemy equipment. They were told that American planes were heavy, technologically unsophisticated, and built by car manufacturers, not aircraft designers. This bred a sense of dangerous superiority. A German ace, sitting in his mess hall in occupied France, would toast to the fat American targets. He believed that as long as he stuck to the classic rules of dogfighting, turn, burn, and get on the tail, he was invincible. He didn't realize that the rules of the game were changing. He didn't realize that the enemy wasn't trying to build a better fencer. They were building a battering ram. The era of the agile knight was ending. The era of the industrial juggernaut was beginning. And nothing symbolized this shift more than the arrival of a plane that looked less like a fighter and more like a milk jug with wings. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared in the skies over Europe, the German pilots couldn't believe their eyes. It was huge. It weighed 7 tons fully loaded. That was twice the weight of a Spitfire or a Bf 109. It had a massive, barrel-chested fuselage. It was undeniably ugly compared to the sleek, shark-like German fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots gave it mocking nicknames. They called it the furniture van. They called it the jugs. They laughed at it. How can that thing fight? They asked. It's too heavy. It will fall out of the sky in a turn. Early encounters seemed to confirm this bias. The P-47s, flying escort for B-17 bombers, often refused to engage in swirling dogfights. They seemed sluggish. German pilots found they could easily turn inside the lumbering American giants. If a Bf 109 got on the tail of a P-47, the German pilot felt the kill was guaranteed. He would fire his cannons, expecting the American plane to disintegrate or burst into flames. But then, something strange would happen. The furniture van wouldn't explode. It would absorb the shells. It would shudder, smoke a little, and then, it would dive. And when it dove, it vanished. The German pilots were baffled. They knew physics. A heavy object falls fast, but the acceleration of the P-47 in a dive was supernatural. They would try to follow, but their own lighter planes would start to shake violently as they approached the speed of sound. The controls would lock up. The P-47 would simply pull away, leaving the German pilot staring at empty air. The mockery began to be tinged with frustration. Why wouldn't these fat planes die? Why wouldn't they fight like gentlemen? The German High Command wanted answers. They needed to understand this machine. They needed to find its weak spot. They issued a standing order: capture a Thunderbolt. Intact. They needed to dissect the beast to understand why their cannon shells were bouncing off its hide. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to get their wish. And the test pilot who flew it would uncover a terrifying truth about the future of the air war. It happened on a cloudy day in late 1943. A P-47 pilot, perhaps disoriented by weather or running low on fuel, made a navigational error. Instead of landing in England, he put his wheels down on a German-controlled airfield in France, or perhaps was forced down by damage but landed intact. Several P-47s were captured during the war. The most famous was a Razorback model designated T9+LK by the Luftwaffe. The German ground crews rushed the plane. They couldn't believe their luck. It was a pristine specimen. The aircraft was immediately refueled and flown by a German expert to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's top-secret test center. Rechlin was the German Area 51. It was where they tested their own jets and rockets, and where they evaluated captured enemy tech. The arrival of the P-47 drew a crowd. German engineers, accustomed to the compact, efficient designs of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, walked around the American giant in awe. They measured the propeller. It was a massive four-bladed paddle, 13 feet across. They looked at the engine. It was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. An 18-cylinder radial monster. It was the size of a Volkswagen. The German engineers were skeptical. "It is too big," they muttered. "The drag will be enormous." They tapped on the fuselage. It felt solid. Heavy. This wasn't a plane built for finesse. It was built like a bridge. They assigned one of their best test pilots to evaluate it. This pilot was an ace. He had flown combat. He knew what a real fighter felt like. He approached the P-47 with a mix of professional curiosity and nationalistic disdain. He was going to prove that this American brick was inferior to the German sword. He walked around the plane, noting the 8 machine gun barrels protruding from the wings. Crude, he likely thought. Why not cannons? The Americans are obsessed with volume of fire, not precision. He climbed up the wing. It was a long climb. The cockpit sat high off the ground. He was about to step into a different world. A world where fuel was plentiful, materials were unlimited, and pilot comfort was considered a tactical advantage. He was about to step out of the Prussian military tradition and into the American industrial dream. The first shock for the German ace came the moment he slid into the seat. German cockpits, like the Bf-109, were notoriously claustrophobic. They were designed to be tight. The pilot was strapped in, so essentially he became part of the machine's linkage. Visibility was poor. The canopy was framed with heavy metal bars. The P-47 cockpit, by comparison, was a ballroom. The German pilot looked around. He could stretch his arms out. He could move his legs. The seat was wide and comfortable. The instrumentation was staggering. There were dials for everything. Fuel gauges, temperature gauges, hydraulic pressure. It looked like the dashboard of a luxury car. "It's like a Cadillac," one German pilot reportedly noted. There were amenities that the Luftwaffe pilots could only dream of. There was a heater. A heater that actually worked. There was an ashtray. There was a relief tube. The Americans had designed a plane for long-range comfort. They understood that a pilot who isn't cramping up or freezing to death is a pilot who can shoot straighter after 4 hours in the air. The German pilot gripped the stick. It was a pistol grip design, different from the German loop. He looked out of the canopy. The visibility was incredible. He sat high up, looking over the nose. The bubble canopy, on later models, or even the Razorback, offered a commanding view of the sky. He felt a strange sensation. He felt safe. In a Bf-109, you sat on top of the fuel tank. You were surrounded by thin duralumin. You felt vulnerable. In the P-47, you sat inside a bathtub of armor plate. The engine in front of you was a massive shield of steel cylinders. The German ace began to understand the American mentality. They weren't building a dueling sword. They were building a tank that could fly. He began the start sequence. He primed the massive engine. He engaged the inertial starter. The propeller turned slowly, whir. Then the magneto caught. Boom! The AV-2800 engine woke up. The entire plane shook. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a German Daimler-Benz inline engine. It was a deep, guttural roar. A distinctively American sound. The sound of 2,000 horsepower waiting to be unleashed. The German pilot checked his gauges. Everything was in the green. He signaled the ground crew to pull the chocks. He was about to take the furniture van for a ride. And he was about to find out that this van didn't just haul furniture. It hauled death. The German ground crew backed away, holding their ears. The engine start of the P-47 was a visceral experience. German engines, like the Daimler-Benz DB605 in the Bf-109, were liquid-cooled inverted V12s. They were precise pieces of engineering. When they started, they whined and then settled into a metallic purr. It was the sound of a high-performance sports car. The Pratt & Whitney AV-2800 double wasp in the nose of the Thunderbolt was different. It was an air-cooled radial engine. It was brute force personified. When the German ace hit the starter, the massive four-bladed propeller jerked forward. Clouds of blue-gray oil smoke puffed from the exhaust stacks, a characteristic of radial engines that always sat for a while. Then, the ignition caught. The sound was deafening. It wasn't a purr, it was a roar. A deep, bass-heavy thrum that vibrated through the pilot's seat and into his bones. It sounded like a piece of heavy industrial machinery, not an airplane engine. The German pilot carefully advanced the throttle to taxi. The plane felt heavy on the ground. The wide landing gear made it stable, unlike the narrow, wobbly gear of the Bf-109 that killed so many novice German pilots in ground loops. He taxied to the end of the Rechlin runway. He lined up. He stood on the brakes and ran the engine up to full power. The noise inside the cockpit, even with his leather flying helmet on, was incredible. The entire airframe shuddered under the torque of 2,000 horsepower trying to rip itself free from the brakes. He released the brakes. The furniture van didn't leap off the line like a lightweight interceptor. It began to roll with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. The acceleration pushed him back into the comfortable seat. The tail came up. The runway blurred. At 100 miles per hour, he gently pulled back on the stick. The 7-ton beast lifted off the concrete with surprising grace. He retracted the gear. He cleaned up the flaps. He pointed the nose at the sky and opened the throttle wide. The German pilot, used to the nimble climb of his own fighters, was stunned. The P-47 wasn't climbing on aerodynamics. It was climbing on raw horsepower. It was clawing its way into the sky, powered by an engine that seemed to have limitless reserves. The Germans had laughed at the weight. They hadn't realized that the Americans had simply decided to overpower gravity. It was an approach to engineering that Germany, starved for resources and fuel, could not afford. But the Americans could. And the result was terrifying. The German test pilot climbed to 25,000 feet. Flying alongside him in a Focke-Wulf FW-190 was another Luftwaffe expert, acting as a chase plane to observe. At this altitude, the air was thin. The German pilot noted that the massive turbocharger, the secret weapon buried deep in the P-47's fuselage, was feeding the engine perfectly. The power didn't drop off. Now, it was time to test the characteristic that baffled the frontline pilots, the dive. The German pilot nosed the big Thunderbolt over. He pushed the throttle to the firewall. He entered a steep, near-vertical dive. What happened next defied his understanding of aerodynamics. Usually, a plane reaches terminal velocity, a point where drag prevents it from going any faster. But the P-47 was so heavy, and so aerodynamic, that it just kept accelerating. Gravity loves mass. And 7 tons of aluminum was falling out of the sky. The airspeed indicator wound past 400 miles per hour. Then 450. Then 500 miles per hour. In the chase plane, the FW-190 pilot tried to keep up. As the German plane approached 450 miles per hour in the dive, it began to buffet. The controls became stiff as concrete due to compressibility, shock waves forming over the wings as they approached the speed of sound. The German plane was shaking violently, threatening to tear itself apart. The chase pilot had to pull out. But inside the P-47, the German ace felt nothing. The control stick remained responsive. The plane was as solid as a rock. It sliced through the air like a heavy dart. He was flying faster than any piston-engine plane he had ever flown. He pulled out of the dive at 10,000 feet. The G-forces crushed him into the seat, but the wings didn't buckle. The airframe didn't groan. It took the punishment without complaint. The German ace realized with a chill why his comrades couldn't catch this plane. If a P-47 pilot got into trouble, all he had to do was push the nose down. No German piston fighter could stay with him in a high-speed dive. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card. The mockery of the heavy plane died in that dive. Weight, they realized, was a weapon. Momentum was a tactic. Having tested the straight-line speed, the German ace decided to test its fighting ability. He signaled the chase plane to engage in a mock dogfight. His instinct, honed by years of flying lightweight fighters, was to turn. He hauled the P-47 into a tight, banking turn, trying to get on the tail of the FW-190. The result was pathetic. The heavy Thunderbolt shuddered. It bled off speed instantly. It felt sluggish and unresponsive. It wallowed in the air, on the verge of stalling. The FW-190 easily cut inside his turn and shot him down within seconds. The German pilot smirked under his oxygen mask. "It is a pig," he thought. "If they try to dogfight us, they are dead." But then, he tried something different. He remembered the incredible momentum from the dive. He realized this plane shouldn't be flown like a fencer, it should be flown like a jouster. He dove again, picking up tremendous speed. Instead of turning horizontally, he pulled the stick back and went straight up. A zoom climb. In a light plane like a Bf-109, inertia runs out quickly in a climb. Gravity takes over and you slow down. But the 7-ton P-47, moving at 450 miles per hour, had enormous kinetic energy stored up. It shot upwards like a rocket. The chase plane tried to follow. It nosed up, but it quickly ran out of energy and stalled, falling back toward the Earth. The German pilot in the P-47 kept going up. He was now thousands of feet above his opponent. He looked down. The FW-190 was slow and helpless below him. He was in the perfect position for a diving attack. The realization hit him hard. The Americans didn't need to turn. They fought in the vertical plane. They used boom and zoom tactics. They used their superior weight and power to dictate the terms of the engagement. They attacked from above, and if they missed, they used their momentum to climb back up to safety before the Germans could get a shot off. The turning trap was a trap for the Germans. If they tried to lure the P-47 into a turning fight, the American would just refuse, zoom away, and come back and kill them from above. The P-47 wasn't a bad fighter. It was just a different kind of fighter. One that rendered traditional German tactics obsolete. After the test flight, the German pilot taxied back to the Rechlin hangars. His opinion of the plane had changed from contempt to grudging respect. But the final lesson came on the ground. The German engineers took him to a separate hangar to see another P-47. This one had been shot down, crash-landed, and recovered by German forces. It was a wreck, used for structural analysis. The pilot walked around the battered airframe. He saw bullet holes in the fuselage skin. He looked inside. The internal structure was massive. The main wing spar looked like a steel girder used in bridge construction. You could hammer on this plane all day, and it wouldn't break. Then, the engineers showed him the engine. This specific R2800 engine had taken a direct hit from a German 20mm cannon shell during combat. The damage was catastrophic. One of the 18-cylinder heads had been completely blown off. In a liquid-cooled German engine, a single bullet hole in the cooling jacket would drain the coolant in minutes. The engine would seize up, and the pilot would have to bail out over enemy territory. But the American radial engine was air-cooled. It didn't need liquid coolant. The engineers explained that according to the intelligence report, this P-47 had flown for another 150 miles with a blown-off cylinder. It had brought its pilot home. The engine was designed with so much redundancy that it could literally run while falling apart. The German ace looked at the shredded metal. He thought about how many times he had fired at a P-47, seen pieces fly off, and watched it keep flying. He had thought he was missing the vital spots. Now he realized, this plane didn't have vital spots. It was over-engineered. It was wasteful. It used 3 times the metal needed for a regular fighter. But it was survivable. The Americans were putting their pilots in flying tanks. They could afford to lose planes, but they were doing everything possible not to lose pilots. Germany, meanwhile, was putting its dwindling supply of expert pilots into fragile machines that folded up at the first hit. The German ace felt a sickening pit in his stomach. He realized that his friends weren't dying because they were bad pilots. They were dying because they were fighting an industrial juggernaut that valued durability over elegance. The furniture van was actually an armored bouncy castle, and the Germans were throwing darts at it. The German ace's final test in the air was firepower. He flew the captured P-47 to a Luftwaffe gunnery range. He was used to the armament of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. Typically, that meant 2 heavy machine guns above the engine and 1 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It was a precision weapon designed for a sharpshooter. You lined up the target in your sights, fired a short burst, and the explosive cannon shell did the work. It was elegant, efficient, and deadly in the hands of an expert. The P-47 was none of those things. The American philosophy was simple: throw as much lead into the sky as possible. The Thunderbolt was armed with 8.50 caliber heavy machine guns, 4 in each wing. The German pilot lined up on a ground target, a surplus truck. He squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The result was terrifying. The plane slowed down noticeably from the sheer recoil of the 8 guns firing simultaneously. The sound wasn't the dak-dak-dak of German guns. It was a continuous, deafening roar, like a giant chainsaw ripping through canvas. 2 streams of fire converged ahead of the plane. Because the guns were wing-mounted, they were set to converge at a specific distance, usually 300 yards. At that point, the 8 streams of bullets met in a buzzsaw of destruction. The target truck didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The .50 caliber round was a kinetic energy weapon. It didn't rely on explosives. It relied on smashing through things. 8 of them hitting a target 10 times a second created a wall of lead. The German pilot realized the implications. In a Bf 109, if your aim was off by a foot, you missed completely. In a P-47, if your aim was off by a foot, you still hit the target with 3 or 4 other guns. You didn't need to be an expert marksman. You just needed to get the enemy in front of you and hold down the trigger. The Americans had democratized aerial combat. They gave average pilots a weapon that could shred anything in the sky through sheer volume of fire. The German ace landed, his ears ringing. He looked at the spent brass casings pouring out of the ejection chutes under the wings. It was wasteful. It was crude. And it was frighteningly effective. As the war progressed, the P-47 found a new role that terrified the German army even more than the Luftwaffe. Ground attack. The German ace at Rechlin didn't just test it as a fighter. He tested its load-carrying capability. German fighters could carry a small bomb or two, but it seriously degraded their performance. They were thoroughbreds forced to pull a plow. The P-47 was a workhorse. The German ground crews loaded it up. It could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs. That was half the payload of a medium bomber. Plus rockets. Plus full ammunition for the 8 machine guns. Fully loaded, it weighed over 8 tons. It needed every inch of the runway to take off, but once it was in the air, it became the ultimate weapon of terror for the German infantryman. They called them JBOs, short for Jag Bomber, fighter bomber. The German test pilot flew a simulated low-level attack over the airfield. Coming in at treetop level at 400 miles per hour, the massive radial engine roaring, the P-47 was a terrifying sight. When it unleashed its machine guns on ground targets, the 8.50 caliber bullets could punch through light armor, destroy locomotives, and turn a convoy of trucks into flaming wreckage in seconds. And because the plane was built like a tank, as the pilot had already learned, it could survive the intense light flak over the battlefield. A 20mm shell that would cripple a Bf-109 would often just punch a hole in the P-47's massive wing, and the plane would keep flying. The German ace realized the strategic nightmare this plane represented. It wasn't just clearing the skies of German fighters. Once the air superiority was won, these thousands of Thunderbolts would drop down and paralyze the entire German transportation network. Trains couldn't run. Trucks couldn't move in daylight. Tanks had to hide in forests. The P-47 was a weapon of total war. It erased the line between the air war and the ground war. It was a flying artillery battery that was virtually indestructible to small arms fire. The German pilot landed from the simulated strafing run, sweating. He knew what this meant for his comrades on the eastern and western fronts. There would be no place to hide. Before the German pilot was done, the engineers at Rechlin solved the final mystery of the furniture van. Why was it so big? They opened up the access panels on the underside of the fuselage. What they found shocked them with its complexity and ambition. The P-47 wasn't just a plane with an engine in the front. The entire aircraft was essentially a flying ductwork system for a massive turbocharger. German high-altitude fighters used mechanical superchargers attached directly to the engine. They were compact and efficient, but they sapped engine power to run. The Americans had chosen a different path. They used a turbocharger, driven by the exhaust gases of the engine. It sat all the way in the back of the fuselage, behind the cockpit. The German ace traced the plumbing. Massive ducts carried air from the intake under the nose, all the way to the back of the plane, through the turbocharger, through an intercooler, and all the way back up to the engine in the front. Other ducts carried red-hot exhaust gases from the engine back to the tail to spin the turbine. It was a plumber's nightmare. It took up huge amounts of internal volume. It was the reason the fuselage was so deep and wide. The plane was literally built around this system. The German engineers shook their heads. Too complex, they said. Too expensive. Too heavy. But the pilot understood what it meant in the air. At 30,000 feet, where the air is thin, German engines struggled to breathe. Their power dropped off dramatically. But up there, the P-47's turbocharger spun up, forcing dense, compressed air into the massive R-2800 engine. At high altitude, the heavy, ugly Jug became a high-speed interceptor that could outrun and outclimb almost anything the Germans had. It was flying artillery designed for the stratosphere. The Germans realized that the plane's size wasn't the result of lazy design. It was a necessary compromise to house a piece of technology that gave the Americans dominance in the high ground of the air war. They had sacrificed sleek looks for raw, high-altitude power. It was sunset at Rechlin. The test program was over. The captured P-47 Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac, casting a long shadow. The German ace walked away from the machine, his flying helmet in his hand. He was exhausted. He had started the evaluation with contempt. He ended it with a profound, sickening sense of dread. He looked back at the massive, barrel-chested plane. It was ugly. It was heavy. It was wasteful. It used gasoline at a rate that would bankrupt the Luftwaffe. It used enough aluminum to build 2 Bf-109s. It was the opposite of everything he had been taught about fighter design. And that was exactly why Germany was going to lose the air war. The P-47 was the physical embodiment of America's industrial might. It proved that the Americans didn't need to be clever. They didn't need to conserve resources. They didn't need to build elegant, fragile machines. They could solve aerial combat problems with brute force, horsepower, and armor plate. They could build a plane that was faster in a dive, deadlier in firepower, safer for the pilot, and more versatile than anything Germany had. And most terrifying of all, they could build them by the tens of thousands. The German ace thought about his squadron mates back at the front. They were flying lightweight, beautiful planes against these armored monsters. They were trying to fight a cavalry duel against a tank. They were brave. They were skilled. The experten were the best pilots in the world. But skill didn't matter anymore. When you are facing a 2,000 horsepower flying tank that can absorb 20mm cannon shells and retaliate with a wall of 8 machine guns, skill is irrelevant. The era of the knight of the air, the individual warrior, was dead. The era of industrial annihilation had arrived. And as the sun set over the German airfield, the silhouette of the American giant seemed to loom over the future of the Third Reich. The pilot knew, with grim certainty, that the war was over. The furniture van had already delivered the defeat, it just hadn't been signed yet.